My name is Ilara D'Souza. I was 12, the day I truly understood how much I was worth, and it wasn't much. That afternoon, my mother, Mira, sat across from two grim-faced strangers at our cramped kitchen table. I crouched by the cracked doorframe, holding my breath as her voice, syrupy but sharp, cut through the stale air. 40,000 rupees. Mr. Nayak. That's the price for a girl this obedient, good stock. No tantrums. She's strong, built for long service. They all laughed, as if I wasn't 3 feet away, listening to every word. I didn't cry. Not then. The tears would come later, but that was the precise moment I decided if they could negotiate my future in installments, then I'd chart my own fate. On my terms. In our coastal village, the custom was an open secret childless couples borrowing daughters from poorer families, a service dressed up as charity. Everyone knew it. No one spoke about what really happened behind closed doors. I was 5 the first time I was loaned out. To Auntie Rekha, a friend of my mother's who couldn't conceive. She called me a lucky charm, made me eat turmeric paste every morning while chanting prayers, and kept me locked in a dim room with shrines and herbs that smelled like rot. When I was returned 3 months later, I was quieter, thinner, and ready for the next loan. By 10. I was what they called experienced. The Patels made me sleep in their dead daughter's room, still untouched, since her drowning. The clothes I wore still smelled of river mud. On the anniversary of her death, they dressed me as her, combed my hair like hers, and fed me her favorite sweets as I whispered scripted lines. I missed you. Mama, I'll be a good girl now. Sometimes, they paid my mother extra for those performances. Then there were the Chopras. They believed I was pure, untainted by family sins. Every new moon, they pricked my finger and mixed my blood into their garden soil, claiming it would help them conceive. It worked, they said, because I survived. But by 12, I'd learned the real game survival wasn't enough. You had to stay invisible and invaluable. The scariest family was the Dezay. They never hit me, never shouted. But their kindness was worse. They tested alternative medicines on me, pills for anxiety, new herbal syrups to stabilize moods, to injections for restlessness. I lost track of the times I woke up dizzy, my arms covered in strange bruises. Other girls like me, borrowed children, vanished overnight. Each time I made a friend, they disappeared by morning, replaced by a new girl from a different village. And no one questioned it. Until I found the diary. I was 11, staying at the Dezay, when I discovered a battered notebook tucked under an old mattress in the storeroom. It belonged to Mina, their previous borrowed daughter, a 15-year-old who'd lived with them for nearly 2 years before suddenly running away. Her last entry read, "Tomorrow they'll marry me to their sick son. They promised I'd finally be family. But I know what that means now. If anyone finds this, I was loved once. Somewhere. By someone." That sentence stayed with me because I didn't remember the last time anyone looked at me like I was loved. That's when I began planning. At first, it was small, fixing their radios, helping with TVs, setting up phones, anything that gave me access to devices. Then I learned how to modify them. A boy at the market taught me how to tune old transistors to hidden frequencies. In every house that borrowed me, I planted transmitters, tiny pirate radios, all tuned to a single frequency I controlled. I taught other borrowed children the same tricks. Every evening, as the village loudspeakers blared prayers, we whispered to each other in code. The Patels locked Maya in the cellar today. The Chopras pricked Leela again. The Desai haven't let Anya out for a week. It became our lifeline, a fragile thread of voices, refusing to disappear. By 12, I had planted devices in 20 homes. But my mother's latest negotiation with Mr. Nyack and his pale, hawk-eyed wife was different. They didn't want a companion or a lucky charm. They needed a kidney. Their own daughter was gravely ill. Better to use borrowed stock than risk family. Mr. Nyack said, sipping chai as he glanced in my direction. She's strong enough. We'll schedule the surgery during the temple festival and evapay.r. Too much noise for anyone to hear. My mother laughed, counting the money as she signed the papers. 1-year loan. Bonus for unexpected medical requirements. That night, I sat cross-legged in the corner of the dark room they'd given me, running my fingers over an old radio I'd rewired. This would be my last chance. If I failed, I'd be dead before my 13th birthday. But this time, I wouldn't just whisper warnings. I'd burn it all down on air. The next morning, as the village prepared for the temple festival, I slipped out to the marketplace. Children played near stalls, their laughter masking my fear as I passed hidden receivers from pocket to pocket. Each device was tuned to my final broadcast at exactly noon. When drums and chants would peak, every radio, every loudspeaker in the village would crackle alive, not with music, but with confessions. By evening, I sat silently in the Nyak's basement. Their operating table gleamed under harsh white light. Above me, I knew the village was gathering for the evening prayers. Mr. Nyack smiled thinly as he approached with a syringe. His wife stood beside him, serene, already wearing gloves. But I wasn't afraid anymore. My thumb pressed a single button hidden in my pocket. Above us, 50 speakers came alive at once. My voice calm, sharp, unflinching, filled the air. You want to know the price of a child? Listen carefully. The moment my voice crackled through 50 speakers, the air shifted. Upstairs, prayer chants stuttered, conversations froze, and heads snapped toward radios that weren't supposed to be on. My voice was calm but lethal, weaving through the village like smoke, unstoppable and choking. I narrated details no child should know: the Patel's dead daughter rituals, the Chopra's blood soil, the Desai's experiments, every scar I bore traced to its owner. And I named names without hesitation. Each sentence hit like a slap, sharper than any punishment they'd inflicted. Because this time the whole village was listening. Mr. Nyak's hand holding the syringe trembled slightly as my voice filled even their sterile basement, exposing them as predators rather than saviors, stripping away the polite facade they had hidden behind for years. His wife lunged for the basement radio, but it was too late. The broadcast was everywhere, spilling from every shop, every shrine, every courtyard. I felt the weight of years dissolve in that moment. And for the first time, I wasn't invisible. Even if I died that night, they would remember my voice, and they would know I didn't go quietly. The villagers outside the Nyack house weren't just shocked, they were transfixed, caught between horror and denial as confession after confession blared from their own radios. Some of them knew exactly what they were hearing because they'd participated too, but now the entire community was implicated, and silence was no longer an option. Mr. Nyack turned to me, mask of control slipping, and hissed, "Turn it off." His wife added coldly, "This is your last chance for mercy." But mercy had never been part of their vocabulary or mine. As I stared at them, I realized the village wouldn't stay paralyzed forever. Soon they would move some to hunt me, others to protect themselves. A few, perhaps finally willing to act. But I couldn't count on their conscience. These people had fed on borrowed children like me for years and buried their guilt under tradition. Mr. Nyack's pale face darkened as he reached for the phone to call his contacts at the police station. I knew what would happen next. They would claim I was disturbed, mentally unstable, a delinquent girl who couldn't adjust to kindness. And they'd present documents signed by my own mother declaring me theirs for a year. Every system was stacked against me. But I'd planned for that too. Upstairs, in the small shrine room where the Nyacks kept their statues, I had hidden a second transmitter, one that hadn't yet been activated. I moved faster than they expected, adrenaline turning my limbs to lightning as I knocked over the metal tray of surgical tools and lunged toward the stairs. His wife grabbed my wrist, nails digging deep. But I bit down hard, tasting blood, forcing her to release me. Her scream was swallowed by the broadcast, still echoing through their own house. My voice narrating every detail of their planned harvest. As I burst into the shrine room, I didn't hesitate. I flipped the switch on the hidden device, triggering a second wave of recordings. This time, voices. They couldn't dismiss as a child's imagination their own. Negotiating my price, discussing sedation protocols, laughing about donor stock. The weight of truth fell heavier than any accusation could. And I knew I had just sealed not only my fate, but theirs, too. Outside, I heard shouting. The crowd that had gathered for evening prayers was no longer passive. Furious voices rose over the prayer bells. A cacophony of horror and denial, and feet pounded the Nyack driveway as people surged forward. I couldn't tell if they were coming to rescue me or lynch me, and in that village, either outcome felt equally plausible. I slipped out the side door into the garden, ducking behind overgrown shrubs where I had buried a small bundle earlier that morning, a battered backpack containing my stolen recordings, scraps of food, and a map I'd copied from Mr. Nyack's office showing the location of every household where I'd planted transmitters. I knew exactly how deep this rot ran, deeper than any one family, deeper even than my mother's betrayal, and if I escaped, I'd make sure the whole world knew. But escape wouldn't be simple. I couldn't run to the police. Not when they'd been paid to look away. I couldn't trust neighbors. because half of them were implicated. Even other borrowed children might hesitate to help me now that things had escalated, because survival teaches loyalty to abusers when it's the only path. As I crept along the edge of the garden, heart hammering, I glimpsed figures at the Nyack gate. Among them was my mother. Mira. Sari impecable, expression unreadable. When she caught sight of me darting toward the side path, her mouth curled into a smile that chilled me more than anything I'd heard that night. She wasn't ashamed. She was calculating, already preparing her performance for the crowd tears. A shock. The narrative that I'd always been difficult, that she'd loaned me out as an act of desperate love, not greed. I slipped into the shadows before she could signal anyone. Moving quickly toward the dense grove behind the Nyack house that led to the old irrigation canal, I had memorized every turn of that path as a child because that was where I used to hide when visiting this house before, and now it would serve as my escape route. My breath came fast but even, trained by years of quiet endurance, and I felt the cool night air against my skin as a relief after the sterile chill of the basement. The crowd's noise was building behind me, not a rescue, but an uproar. Paused, some calling for justice, others demanding silence. They're most confused and afraid that their secrets might be next. I knew then that my broadcast hadn't just exposed the Nyacks, it had ignited panic among everyone who had borrowed children over the years. And they would come together now, united by shared guilt. By the time I reached the edge of the grove, the Nyack compound was a blur of movement and torches, villagers arguing among themselves, accusations flying. Some blamed the Nyacks for crossing a line, others blamed me for daring to speak. But few expressed genuine sympathy. I could see it clearly. Now the system that had consumed me wasn't about individuals, but about a shared delusion, a village-wide pact to keep things hidden under the guise of tradition. As I crouched by the canal, trying to decide whether to follow it to the next village or double back toward the main road, I realized that running would buy me only time. Eventually they'd catch me unless I found a way to force their hand publicly beyond their control. That's when I saw him, Rafiq. A quiet boy from the electronics stall at the market, crouching by the far edge of the canal. He didn't say a word, but he held out something small, an old flip phone. Battered, but functional. I took it without hesitation. And he vanished into the trees before I could thank him. He'd known. Maybe he'd known for months. The phone wasn't much, but it was enough. With it, I could contact the one person outside this cursed village who might believe me an old journalist who once visited the market. The only outsider who ever listened when I asked questions. I tapped his number from memory. Heart pounding. Praying he hadn't forgotten me. His voice answered on the third ring. Rough and skeptical at first. Until he heard my name. Ilara, where are you? What's happening? I didn't waste time on explanations. Record this. I whispered. Everything you're about to hear, record it and play it loud. Then I raised the phone high as I stepped out of the shadows, straight into the chaos at the Nyack compound, and spoke the words that would force the village to choose between protecting itself or burning down everything they had built. This is Ilara D'Souza, and tonight I will name every family who ever borrowed a child. The moment I raised the phone and spoke my name into the chaos, a hush fell sharp. almost physical silence, as every villager turned toward me. I held that silence like a blade, knowing that for once, I had control over the next sentence, and the one after that. I began calmly, clearly, and without hesitation naming families, but Rizar Ter and Akizarian, describing rituals, recounting scars that lined my skin and the bodies of other borrowed children. I watched their faces shift, first shock, then shame, and then something far more dangerous: calculation. They weren't innocent. They weren't horrified at the crimes, only at being exposed. And as I named name after name, I could almost feel their defenses rebuilding behind their expressions. Even as their eyes widened, I could see them writing new scripts in their head stories to justify every detail I recited. Excuses to explain how their borrowed child had misunderstood, exaggerated, or simply lied. These people weren't hearing revelations, they were preparing rebuttals. And standing at the center of that swirling crowd, I realized something chilling: this village would never admit guilt. Not unless forced. Behind the gasps and murmurs was a single shared instinct to contain me before I could speak another word. And yet I couldn't stop. Every sentence I spoke felt like peeling away another layer of the lies they had wrapped around themselves for years. My mother's voice sliced through the growing tension first. Calm, clear, deliberate. She stepped forward. Sorry, pristine. Hair, perfect. Expression, one of measured heartbreak. Helada, she said, and loud enough for everyone to hear. We all know how troubled you've been since childhood. Your mind isn't well. These stories you're telling, they're not real. Sweetheart, I felt my stomach twist at her words. But I didn't waver. Her performance was flawless. Exactly what I had expected. And behind her, others followed suit. Mr. Patel stepped forward next. Feigning sorrow as he addressed the crowd, I treated her as my own daughter. We all did. This isn't her fault. She's disturbed. Each word he spoke was like poison seeping into the atmosphere, turning sympathy into suspicion, pity into doubt. And I knew exactly what would happen next. They would close ranks, paint me as a liar, and bury the truth beneath a veil of concern and fabricated compassion. But before they could fully control the narrative, the phone in my hand buzzed softly, a sign that the journalist was still listening. Recording every second of this confrontation, that knowledge steadied me, gave me the strength to raise my voice again. As louder this time, cutting through their manufactured sorrow. If you claim I'm lying, and then explain this, and I reached into my backpack and held up a small stack of photographs. The crowd stiffened as I flipped through image after image: bruises, scarred palms, blood-stained sheets, handwritten notes from other borrowed children I had met and taught to broadcast. Their denials faltered, some stepping back as they recognized the scenes in those pictures, in their homes, their rituals. But just as I felt the tide begin to shift in my favor, a new, more sinister threat emerged. Mr. Nayak, flanked by two men I recognized from the village council, stepped forward, holding an official-looking folder. His smile was cold, sharp, victorious. These are the documents. he announced. Signed by Alara's own mother. Full guardianship. Witnessed by elders. Dated and stamped. Everything she claims happened under her mother's permission. The crowd surged forward to glimpse the papers, and I felt the balance shift once again. Their willingness to question me was suddenly bolstered by this new weapon paperwork, the most potent tool of those who wished to erase inconvenient truths. The villagers didn't care about ethics, only legality. And with that document in their hands, they could pretend that everything I had endured was above board, perfectly arranged. And, therefore, nothing to see here. I could see it in their eyes, already relief. And relief that they didn't have to think too hard about what they'd just heard or what they'd just seen. Legality was their refuge. And with those papers, they were slipping back into denial as easily as sliding into an old coat. I had to act fast. Before their doubt solidified into indifference, I spoke again. Voice steady, but hard as stone. If you think guardianship papers make this right, then ask yourselves why they needed sedation protocols, and why I found records hidden in their homes detailing every child who didn't survive. The air snapped taut again. Hesitation, creeping back into their expressions. But this time, their silence was tinged with unease rather than outrage. I had found the one chink in their armor, their fear that I might reveal not just their cruelty but their losses, the children who didn't make it. The children they couldn't parade around as success stories. The invisible dead, whose names had been buried twice over. Before anyone could recover from my accusation, a child's voice rang out from the back of the crowd. Small but clear. Piercing through the thick atmosphere. My name is Tara. I'm 8. She's telling the truth. Heads whipped around. Little Tara. Borrowed by the Kumars 2 years ago. To her voice shaking, but her spine straight. Stood next to an old transistor radio, one I'd helped her hide weeks ago. Her trembling hand hovered over the volume dial, and when no one moved to stop her, she twisted it sharply. My recordings began to play not just my voice, but children's voices. Dozens of them, layered and overlapping, each telling fragments of their story's abuse, isolation, strange rituals, medical experiments. The spell broke. Suddenly, the crowd was no longer looking at me but at each other, seeing guilt in their neighbors' eyes. Suspicion ricocheting from face to face as old grievances resurfaced and alliances fractured. The villagers were realizing that this wasn't just about me, this was about all of them. And the lines between perpetrator and bystander were blurring fast. I stepped back, letting their paranoia take hold. Knowing that confusion was my best protection now, my mother's face paled as she realized her careful narrative was unraveling. And I caught a glimpse of her true emotion at last. Not love, not concern, but pure fear that she would no longer be able to profit from my existence. Fear that the delicate web she had spun for years was finally tearing apart. As the villagers turned on each other, I slipped into the shadows once again, the journalist's voice still in my ear, urging me to keep moving, to get to a safer place where we could plan the next step. I knew then that the night wasn't over, not even close. The village was teetering on the edge of chaos. And soon they would try to restore control the only way they knew how, by silencing me for good. But I had one more card to play. One final revelation that would make even the most loyal enablers question their own survival. The night air was cool on my face as I moved swiftly down the path toward the riverbank, where I had hidden my most dangerous secret of all, a ledger stolen from the village council's archives, listing payments, transactions, and signatures that implicated not just families, but elders, clergy, even police. I was going to expose them all, but first I needed to survive until dawn. The riverbank was exactly as I'd left it, quiet. Moonlit. Deceptively peaceful. I knelt near the gnarled roots of an old banyan tree, fingers digging into the earth, until they found the battered tin box I had buried weeks ago. Inside was the ledger, yellowed pages bound with twine. Covered in cramped handwriting, the true record of my village's sins. It wasn't just a list of families who had borrowed children. It was proof of a system, an economy that thrived on our silence. Our blood. And our disappearances? Names of respected elders. The imam's signature. Receipts from the police. Donations from prominent merchants, all recorded meticulously. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry at the thoroughness of their corruption. But one thing was clear with this ledger. I could destroy their story of tradition once and for all, but even as I clutched it to my chest, I felt a tremor of dread. The villagers wouldn't just let this surface without a fight. I could already hear them regrouping. Their moment of confusion transforming into resolve as they realized that silencing me was now a matter of survival, not shame. They would come after me not as individuals, but as a united front, because their very power depended on suppressing this evidence. And in their eyes, my betrayal was complete. I hadn't just embarrassed them, I'd threatened the fragile lie that kept their hierarchy intact. My mother would lead the charge. She knew how valuable the ledger was. She had probably told them already that I might have something even worse than my broadcast recordings. And now they would be hunting for me with purpose. I didn't have time for fear. I tucked the ledger into my backpack and ran, 2 feet silent on the narrow dirt path that hugged the river's curve. The phone in my pocket vibrated. The journalist was still there. His voice crackling through the weak signal. Urgent, but calm. Elara. Listen carefully, he said. You need to get to the main road. I'm sending someone to meet you. Don't go back into the village. His confidence steadied me for a heartbeat. But I knew he underestimated the villagers' reach. They wouldn't wait for me to run. They would lock down every exit, mobilize their network of allies, and turn every checkpoint into a trap. I couldn't just run blindly. I had to outthink them, predict their next moves. And most of all, I had to keep moving before they could close the circle. Halfway down the path, I heard it, footsteps. Many of them moving fast. Voices calling out in rehearsed urgency, Alara, come home. Child, you're confused. We just want to help you. Their lies rang hollow now. But their speed was real. I veered off the path into the dense scrub near the river's edge, using every trick I'd learned from years of hiding during loans to slip between shadows and stay out of sight. The voices grew closer, torches flickering in the night. The smell of sweat and fear mixing with the damp earth. They didn't spread out, they moved as a single unit, sweeping the area in a pattern that spoke of experience. They had done this before. I realized maybe not for me, but for others who had tried to run, I wasn't the first borrowed child who'd wanted to escape, only the first to make it this far. That thought hit me like a blow. How many others had reached this point only to be dragged back, erased from memory? Their absence explained away with practiced stories. The ledger in my backpack felt heavier than ever, not just paper, but a burden of all those silenced voices. I crouched low as the torches passed just meters away. My breath shallow but steady, heart pounding loud enough that I thought they might hear it. One man paused, scanning the bushes with narrowed eyes, but then moved on as another called out, "Nothing here. Check the next bend." I waited until their voices faded before crawling forward, every muscle aching, mind racing with calculations. I couldn't reach the main road without crossing the old rice paddy's flat, exposed ground, where I'd be visible from every direction. But there was one place no one would look for me tonight. The temple. Not the large one where the festival was being held, but the ruined temple on the outskirts, abandoned for years, overgrown and crumbling. The villagers avoided it, claiming it was cursed, haunted by spirits. I had hidden there once as a child during one of my loans. And even then I'd sensed it was the perfect place to disappear. If I could reach it before they regrouped, I could hide there long enough to contact the journalist properly, maybe even arrange a public handoff of the ledger in daylight. With outsiders watching, the path to the temple was treacherous, winding through thorny brush and rocky ground. But I moved quickly, ignoring the cuts on my arms, the sharp sting of branches tearing at my skin. Every step felt like a race against history itself, as if I was trying to outrun generations of complicity that had trapped children like me in this system for decades. When I finally reached the temple steps, my legs nearly gave out. The building was, as I remembered, broken pillars, roof half collapsed, vines choking the carved stone deities whose faces had long since eroded into featureless masks. I slipped inside, breath catching in my throat as I crouched behind a fallen column, clutching the phone and dialing the journalist again. He answered instantly, his voice urgent, but still calm. "I can see your location ping. Stay there. Someone is coming. But it'll take time. Just hold out until sunrise if you can." Sunrise? That felt like a lifetime away. Outside, I could already hear the villagers spreading out again, this time moving methodically, leaving nothing unchecked. It wouldn't take them long to remember the temple, and when they did, they'd come armed not just with torches, but with the fury of people whose secrets were slipping from their grasp. I pulled the ledger from my bag, flipping through the pages one last time, memorizing details I hadn't noticed before, amounts paid, signatures I recognized, even scribbled notes about children who had gone missing during loans. The horror of it settled deeper into my bones. But so did the resolve. If I fell tonight, someone had to know all of this. And the journalist's voice in my ear was the only tether I had left. I read page after page aloud to him, speaking quickly but clearly, my voice echoing off the stone walls of the ruined temple. Every name I spoke felt like another nail in the coffin of their conspiracy. every transaction, I described a blow to their false narrative of charity and tradition. I didn't care that my throat was raw, that my hands were shaking. I would speak until I couldn't anymore. As I turned another page, a shadow fell across the temple doorway. My breath hitched. But I didn't stop reading, forcing my voice to stay steady as footsteps approached. Then a figure stepped into the faint moonlight filtering through the broken roof, and I froze. It was not my mother. Not Mr. Nayak. Not any elder. It was Rafik, the boy from the electronics stall again. His face was pale, eyes wide. But he carried something in his hands, a power bank and an old shortwave radio. I rewired it. He whispered, "You can transmit from here, beyond this village." My heart slammed against my ribs as I reached for the device. This was it. The chance I hadn't dared hope for. I could broadcast beyond their borders, beyond their control, to anyone who was listening. Rafik knelt beside me, connecting wires with shaking fingers, explaining in rapid whispers how he had hidden parts from the market. Waiting for this moment? He hadn't known when it would come, but he had prepared anyway. We worked in silence, urgency, tightening every motion, until the radio's light blinked to life. A faint, static crackling from its battered speaker. I took a deep breath and leaned into the microphone, now ready to speak not just to the village but to the entire world. And as I opened my mouth, I heard the first footsteps outside the temple, voices calling my name, their tone no longer pleading but furious. Desperate. They had realized too late that their secrets could no longer be contained, and I was going to make sure they never forgot who had exposed them. I leaned toward the old microphone, pulse hammering in my ears, knowing this would be my last chance to speak freely. Static hissed, followed by silence that felt heavier than any noise. Then, clear and sharp, my voice cut through the crackle. My name is Alara D'Souza. I am 12 years old, and tonight, I will tell you everything this village has tried to bury. The words didn't tremble. They emerged strong, deliberate, weaving through the static like a lifeline. Rafik said beside me, eyes locked on the flickering light of the transmitter as the signal found strength and range far beyond the village, into towns, highways, and homes that had no idea what lay hidden in this place that called itself respectable. Outside, footsteps gathered. Torches bobbed through the trees, shadows converging on the temple, but I kept speaking, reading names from the ledger, recounting horrors disguised as tradition, narrating how each child had been treated, traded, and discarded. I didn't hesitate. I didn't soften the language. I wanted every listener beyond these borders to feel the weight of what had happened. To picture borrowed children sitting at unfamiliar tables, forced to become ghosts of other families' grief. I wanted them to know the rituals that used our blood to bless gardens, the rooms where girls were dressed in dead children's clothes, the basements where sedatives waited. I wanted them to understand that this wasn't an isolated village quirk. It was a market, a business, an industry hiding in plain sight. And as I spoke, I heard something new in the voices. Outside panic. They had realized the transmitter was operational, that my voice was no longer confined to this village but spilling out into the airwaves like spilled ink. impossible to contain. The crowd didn't chant anymore. They didn't call for my surrender or beg me to come home. Instead, I heard frantic commands, harsh orders to break through the temple doors, to silence me before too many people heard too much. Their unity was fracturing. Some still wanted to capture me alive to spin a story of mercy, while others whispered of ending this permanently. I could almost feel their desperation as they struggled to agree. How were their powers slipping with every sentence I spoke aloud? Then, in the corner of the ruined temple, the radio crackled again, a sign the journalist was still listening. His voice emerged faint but firm. "You're being heard. Aita. Stay strong. I'm forwarding your broadcast everywhere. Cities, newsrooms, social media. They can't silence you now." His words were oxygen. For the first time since I'd begun this war, I felt momentum shift outside this village's borders. My voice was no longer trapped in these narrow streets. It was escaping, weaving itself into places where their traditions meant nothing and their papers, signatures, and guardianship contracts would be seen for what they were: tools of coercion. Not consent, but I also knew they wouldn't give up easily. Their entire system rested on the illusion of respectability. And exposure was worse than collapse. It was disgrace. Suddenly, the first rock struck the temple wall, hard enough to send chips of stone flying. The villagers had stopped debating. They were advancing stone by stone, to determine to break through before sunrise. Before my transmission reached too many ears, Rafiq worked feverishly beside me, adjusting wires, boosting the signal, whispering numbers under his breath as he recalibrated for maximum range. I kept speaking, voice hoarse but relentless, reading from the ledger even as the wall behind me cracked under another blow. Every thud, every shout outside only strengthened my resolve. The violence I was hearing was proof that they were afraid, terrified that their crimes were no longer theirs to narrate, that I had stolen their ability to control the story. Then, without warning, my mother's voice rose above the crowd, cutting through the noise with terrifying clarity. "Aita," she called, her tone no longer soft or rehearsed, but raw with fury. "Come outside now. Don't destroy your family's name like this. We can fix this. We can explain." Her words weren't meant for me. They were meant for anyone listening beyond the village. An early attempt to shape the narrative, to sound like the concerned parent of a disturbed child, begging her daughter to stop lying. But I knew her well enough to hear the tremor beneath the performance. She wasn't asking me to come home. She was demanding that I stop humiliating her, and humiliation was the one thing she couldn't forgive. I didn't answer her directly. Instead, I turned back to the microphone and said loud enough for the radio to catch every word. The woman outside calling herself my mother sold me 6 times before I turned 12. She signed my body away for surgeries. She negotiated my value by weight and blood type. She doesn't want to help me. She wants to protect herself. That sentence landed like a stone in still water. The crowd outside fell silent again. Even the villagers holding torches, lowering them instinctively. I had named her plainly, without euphemism or apology. And in doing so, I had stripped her of the story she was trying to craft. I had left her standing exposed before neighbors, before the world beyond. Before even the other conspirators whose loyalty would now begin to crumble as they realized she couldn't protect them either. Rafiq gave me a tiny nod as he connected the final wire, indicating that the signal was now at full strength. I seized the moment and spoke my last line of the night. I have names. I have records. And if anything happens to me, they will be shared with every media outlet, every human rights organization, every official who listens. You can stop me now, but you cannot erase what I've already shared. That was the sentence that tipped the scales completely. Even as the villagers prepared to storm the temple, I saw hesitation ripple through their ranks. Some lowered their torches. Some stepped back, realizing that killing me now would only confirm everything I had said. Others clung to denial, demanding action. But their unity was broken, fractured by fear, guilt, and self-interest. But my voice alone wouldn't protect me if they rushed the temple. I turned to Rafiq, who was pale but steady, and whispered, "You need to go. Take the ledger. If I'm captured, you're the last chance." His eyes widened, terrified, but he nodded. He knew this fight had never been about me surviving. It was about ensuring that no one could pretend ignorance ever again. As he slipped into the shadows with the ledger tucked under his arm, I took a deep breath and walked slowly to the temple doorway, where the villagers waited. My mother stood at the front, her expression a perfect mask of sorrowful dignity. But her eyes burned with rage. Mr. Nyack beside her held a rope, crude but effective, ready to tie me down and drag me back if necessary. But I didn't flinch. I met their gaze head-on and spoke one final sentence. "I'm loud enough that even those at the back could hear me. You've spent years teaching me shame. Tonight, I teach you what shame really feels like." The villagers hesitated. No one stepped forward first. Their indecision gave me precious seconds, and in those seconds, I saw a flicker of movement near the edge of the crowd. Outsiders, journalists, police from a neighboring district, flashlights cutting through the dark. Rafiq had reached them faster than anyone expected. The village was no longer in control of its borders or its story. They were surrounded not by their neighbors, but by witnesses. And for the first time in my life, I saw fear in my mother's face that wasn't about being exposed to me, but to everyone else. That was the moment I knew the story had shifted forever. The flashlights cut through the dark like knives, beams of truth slicing into every corner where this village had once hidden its rot. The outsiders had arrived, journalists with cameras raised, officers from a neighboring district already barking questions, and curious townspeople drawn by the crackling urgency of my broadcast. For the first time in years, the villagers' carefully crafted silence wasn't enough to protect them. I could see it in their faces, the shock of being observed by those who hadn't grown numb to their customs. The dawning realization that this time, no story they told would erase the evidence now scattered like ash across airwaves and memories alike. Their power had been built on secrecy. I had burned that secrecy to the ground. My mother tried first. She stepped forward with impeccable grace, voice soft but steady, weaving her narrative. This poor girl has suffered so much confusion. We've all tried to help her. We sheltered her, fed her, gave her a home when she was troubled. She's hurt, not dangerous. Please understand that. It was a masterful performance. dripping with carefully curated vulnerability. But I could see the way the cameras stayed trained on me instead. The way one officer's gaze hardened as he took in the rope clutched in Mr. Nayak's hands. The broken temple doorway, and the villagers who still clutched makeshift weapons as if they didn't realize the world had changed around them. My mother's words fell flat. A story too polished, too rehearsed, and too late. When I spoke next, my voice was steady but sharper than any accusation she could have feared. I have recordings, documents, names, payment ledgers signed by every family here, rituals disguised as charity, medical experiments hidden as tradition. This entire village has profited from children like me, loaned out like cattle, bartered for money, obedience, and organs. The outsiders didn't flinch or look away. They listened. Cameras flashed. Pens scratched in notepads. One journalist raised a recorder toward my face, and I leaned in slightly, giving them the words they needed to understand the scale of what this place truly was. They called it tradition. I call it trafficking. The villagers began to fracture visibly, then some tried to slip away quietly, hoping to disappear before questions reached them. Others clung to each other, eyes darting nervously toward the officers who were already noting names and whispering instructions into radios. And a few, like my mother and Mr. Nayak, stood frozen, too entrenched in their roles to realize that no one believed them anymore. The fear I'd seen on my mother's face earlier deepened into something uglier now: panic. Raw and unfiltered, as she understood that her performance couldn't compete with evidence, that every lie she had polished so carefully over the years was crumbling under the weight of truth she couldn't control. Then the questions started, direct, brutal, public. Officers pulled elders aside, demanding explanations for the children listed in my ledger. Journalists interviewed villagers who stammered and stumbled, unsure whether to defend the old ways or distance themselves as fast as possible. A reporter approached my mother, asking bluntly why her daughter had broadcast so many detailed accusations. I watched as her composure cracked completely for the first time. No clever answer came. No graceful pivot. She simply stared, mouth opening and closing like a fish, caught between shame and fury. And in that pause, in that silence, I knew we had won the first battle. They were no longer in control of the narrative. But my victory was not without cost. I felt it in my legs, weak from running and fear, and in my throat, raw, from hours of speaking truth aloud. Rafiq returned quietly, slipping the ledger back into my hands with a nod that spoke volumes. Every page copied, every record secured, every name cataloged and ready to be delivered where it would matter most. He stayed by my side then, silent but present, as if he understood that this moment, though historic, was also deeply personal. Together, we watched the villagers implode, some crying, some shouting at each other, old alliances dissolving in seconds as blame ricocheted through the crowd. The same unity that had once sustained their power was now their undoing, splintering under scrutiny they had never prepared for. As dawn broke over the village, pale light bathing the broken temple and the chaos it now held, I felt a strange stillness settle over me. This place had defined every moment of my life, every betrayal, every scar, every stolen piece of childhood. But today it belonged not to them, but to me. The villagers would face investigations, arrests, trials. Their traditions would be dissected in courts and headlines, being exposed for the cruelty they were. But for me, justice was something quieter, more personal standing here. Unafraid. Surrounded by witnesses who would ensure I was no longer dismissed as a troubled child or an ungrateful borrower. I was a survivor, and my voice had carried farther than they'd ever imagined possible. An officer approached then, voice gentle but firm, asking if I had somewhere safe to go. The question caught me off guard after all. Nowhere had ever been safe before. But I glanced at Rafiq, then at the journalist who stood nearby, notebook in hand, waiting patiently for my answer. And I realized that safety was no longer a physical place, but a choice to keep speaking, to keep naming, to keep remembering. I handed the ledger to the officer carefully, making sure cameras captured the moment. Then I spoke clearly. For everyone to hear, this is only the beginning. There are more villages like this, more borrowed children. I won't stop until they're free too. That sentence felt like a door swinging open in my chest, a promise, not just to myself, but to every child who had ever whispered their name into a hidden transmitter and hoped someone was listening. And as reporters swarmed around me, microphones thrust forward, flash popping, I felt no fear anymore. I answered their questions calmly, fully, giving them the details they needed to write stories that would ripple far beyond this place. Stories that would reach ears I would never meet, but who needed to know that this kind of darkness existed and that it could be fought. My mother stood nearby, utterly silent, surrounded by officers now. Her face drained of color, her future reduced to damage control and inevitable consequence. She didn't look at me again, not once. Perhaps she finally understood that her greatest mistake wasn't selling me, it was underestimating me. She had taught me to be silent, obedient, compliant, but in doing so, she had also taught me to observe, to adapt, to endure, and those were skills I had used to dismantle everything she had built. She hadn't raised a victim. She had raised a witness, and witnesses are dangerous when they learn how to speak. The sun rose fully then, bathing the temple in gold, turning ruins into something almost holy again. And as villagers were led away in pairs, heads bowed, chains clinking softly, I felt the weight on my shoulders begin to lift, not all at once, but enough to stand straighter, enough to breathe deeper, enough to plan the next steps. Because there would be next steps. The story didn't end with this village. The loan system had roots in places far beyond these fields and lanes. And I had seen enough to know that even exposure didn't guarantee justice unless I kept pushing. I walked away from the temple slowly, deliberately, aware of every camera, capturing every step. My name would be known now. But more importantly, the names of the children who hadn't survived would be known too, spoken aloud, written down, recorded permanently in a history that could no longer pretend they never existed. My revolution had begun as a desperate act of survival, but it had become something larger, a reminder that even the smallest voice, when determined and unrelenting, can force an entire village to face itself. And in that knowledge, there was a strange peace. Fragile, but real. I didn't look back at the temple again. I didn't need to. It would stand forever as the place where everything had changed for me. For them. For all of us.